There's some basic things that if you understand how the brain works on a very basic level, it might make some of these things that you hear about, like endorphins and dopamine and serotonin and all this stuff, make some sense, none of this psychobabble. The first thing you got to look is a basic building block, which is the brain cell. And a cell, unless motivated, will do nothing. It has to have some sort of motivation to receive or send any kind of information. The cell has, your main body, and then there's these you'll see the branches coming off. Those are dendrites, and they reach out to other cells to share whatever they're doing with other cells. And then they have their own receptor site for a dendrite that, is trying to talk to it. So the cells are close, and while the information is in electronic form as it passes through the cell, to bridge a gap called the synapse, it releases specific chemicals. Most of them you hear are neurotransmitters, and they're like letters of an alphabet, so the information is kind of coded with these neurotransmitters. So now you have the information ready to send across, but the other side could care less what you have for it, unless you give it a reward. And what it gives is a chemical called an endorphin. An endorphin acts sort of like an opiate. It, in fact, they plug into all the centers that opiates plug into, mostly dopamine. And that actually is how opiates work to block pain. When information comes in from the outside body, it is then rewarded to the next cell with dopamine to pay attention to it. And the more dopamine released with a signal, the more the next cell will pay attention to it. That's sort of like our volume control. When you have that information come in, that dopamine triggers the type of information that is being passed up to the brain and lets the brain process. We'll get into how that works later on. So as you're passing this information on, it is released with neurotransmitters coding the information, and then an endorphin as the reward to pass to get the next cell actually rewarded to take that information and do with it what's programmed into it. So as you get this processing through the brain and you have all these cells going and firing, every firing of every synapse is a little piece of an opiate that's bathing the brain in feel-good juice. It sort of like makes an angsty feeling go away when that's going on. And that's why most people have sort of like a happy feeling about life. Now, there are few that have an issue processing those endorphins. And what happens is the information as it's passed from one cell to the other, the cell that's giving the information has coded it in things that are like little keys. And on the receiving end are the keyholes. And that's how the receptor knows what the information is it's receiving. It's putting in all those little keys and clicking them on, coding the information to then pass electrically through the cell. Well, the endorphins say there's 10 receptors, which is the ideal amount for each endorphin. The volume control of how much that information in will then go between that 1 and 10 position. Okay? The higher means more endorphins are plugging into little keyholes and making their little click to turn on the receptors. Now, this is how Ritalin works. Ritalin, there's a program that unlocks the receptors and kicks the key out to reset the system for the next key to come through. There is a chemical that causes that unkeying, and what it does to the endorphin is it breaks it down into smaller components, and that's how it resets the system. It's a reuptake system, they call it in the professional world, if you hear that term. What amphetamines do is makes the dopamine stay in that receptor longer, so there's a bigger bang for your buck, put it that way. See, what happens for some people is they may not have all 10. They may only have 5 receptors for that dopamine. That means everything always kind of comes through, a lot, but, Not that important. I can blow it off. Some people are even born with maybe 3 or 2, so they're not even interested in anything that's coming in from the outside world. Now, there's some people that are low. They want to be thrill seekers because they want to experience that high, so they then go overboard trying to get sensory in to get that dopamine high. But every signal coming in from the outside sensory world of outside the brain carries dopamine with it. And the stronger the signal, the more dopamine is being released, with the information saying, I hurt, I am in pain, this is soft. Anything that is a sensory input has dopamine being released. Now, there are other endorphins. The next one, which I hear a lot about, is serotonin. But before we get to that, I want to go to a second one, or a third one in this order, but I put it second because it comes just above dopamine. It's called norepinephrine. What's interesting about this being coded into the information is it routes the information through to the limbic part of the brain, which is the emotional, hormonal, that part of the brain that runs the body, okay? To route the information through that, norepinephrine is put on, okay? Now, what that does is that's where all your emotional feelings, all those passions, love, hate, anger, frustration, those all come through that circuitry. And if you're having a problem processing norepinephrine, your brain's going to make up more of that information processing to make up for it. So then you have serotonin. That serotonin is borrowed from lower mammals, where you use it for telling your brain that your stomach's full. That's why you see it down in that part of the body. But what it borrowed it for is the frontal cortex of the brain, the part of the brain that doesn't take new information in. It just sorts out what's already up there and makes connections between them. That part, that thinking part, is then rewarded into the circuit caused by serotonin. Now, here's where the hyperactivity comes in. If you can't get enough dopamine, your brain will initiate more, hence hyperactivity or sensitizing. Norepinephrine, if you have obsession for that, can't get enough of it, everything's always going to be a drama because your brain wants it. Your brain doesn't care what car you drive. It doesn't care what color your teeth are. It just wants to get high off these endorphins. Now, if you then have the serotonin obsession, well, of course, that's a thinking junkie, someone whose mind is just always on. And that's that voice that some people have in their head that they can never turn off. It's the voice that most people say they have to solve a problem. They think about it. They bring that little voice up. They get an idea together, and they're like, oh, okay, I've solved the problem, and the voice goes away. The people who are the serotonin junkies, they're the ones who can't turn that off. That brain's always analyzing everything, and sometimes it ends up with its own voice, and that's the scary part. And a lot of times that voice is a voice the parents said to them as a child. And that's the danger, and I won't get into my little parenting rant at this time. So I'm hoping that people understand what endorphins do when you hear about them. Because think about it, if your brain can't process enough endorphins at any one time, it either has to initiate more of what you're short on, or if you can't keep that up, the endorphin level drops, and that's where you feel depression. The problem with someone wired like this is for some it can take a lot of energy to keep up the level of processing just to feel good. Because think about it. If you can't get it on a scale of 1 to 10, everything comes in at a 3. You're not going to know what to pay attention to. Plus, your brain's going to want to look at a few other inputs to try and make up for that loss of processing, trying to make yourself feel good. That's where a lot of study problems, and I can attest to that, come from. So looking back on what you've got to work with, this is sort of like a primer to kind of get it going as far as a framework, and I will try to do more. I'm also working on a paper I wrote when I was switching from mechanical engineering to neuropsychology, which is a cortical feedback loops. This actually talks about the pathways in the brain where information is passed to different parts of the brain, and they're little, what they call feedback loops. And I put them in making a comment, gee, are these the voices in our head? I remember this is 40 years old, printed on a Commodore 64 dot matrix Panasonic KXP 1180 printer that had 3 built-in fonts. Lucky dog that I was. So I want to do that one. I've already got like about 3 in the can reading that paper, but none of them are good enough that I want to stick them out there. But this is more conversational, and I'm going to just put it out as it is. Most of you probably never heard my voice before. I won't sit in front of the camera. I'm sorry for that. Part of my little freakiness is not being, I don't know, recognized out there. So I'm sure there's people out there that know what I'm talking about. So we'll leave it there for now. Okay.